So welcome to the almost final session. Is this working? Yeah. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Patrick Haggard, who's actually Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Faculty of Brain Sciences at UCL. He's a leading neuroscientist. His research has profoundly shaped our understanding of voluntary action and body representation and the sense of agency. And his work bridges psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, with actually quite deep insights into how we experience being in control of our actions. So I don't remember how we first met, but we were certainly involved in a European project together called VERE, which started in 2010. And he's been very active, was very active in that project, and also, I think, twice has been the ethics advisor on projects that I had. And we more or less kept in touch, a bit on and off, ever since that time. So I'm very happy that he was able to make it today and give a very interesting talk on the ethics of metaverse and digital touch. So over to you.
Thank you very much. That's working. Good. Thank you very much, Mel. It's very nice to be here. So it feels quite autobiographical because Mel, you were the person who first got me interested in ethics and in tech ethics. I have no formal background in ethics, but the more I have thought about it, the more I've enjoyed it, and I think it's quite good to have research scientists who are also doing ethics. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be back in this group and back in this world. The other thing I should say is I'm completely unused to talking sitting down. I'm used to giving a talk standing up, but I can see that the Spanish tradition is to give a talk sitting down, so I will try to do that. Good. Okay, so in the next, we've got a 45-minute slot, maybe a little bit less, and there should be time for questions, because there are often questions about ethics. So I'm going to go quite quickly through 3 points, of which the second one is the most important and the most time-consuming, and that's what I'm going to try to do in the next little while. So first I'm going to make some general remark about tech ethics, which is suitable for people who worry about tech ethics and who don't like it and are afraid of it. So this is to make you feel less anxious. I have been working particularly on the sense of touch. So this is a research interest of mine, and I've got particularly involved in the ethics of digital touch. So the particular bit of the metaverse where I have done most of my ethical thinking is the immersive, haptic, tactile part of the metaverse. So I've got perhaps most detail to say on that, and then some very speculative remarks about technological transformation at the end. So the first thing to point out is the way that all technological development is full of unintended consequences. So there is technological development, technologies arise and they change and they improve, and they never actually quite develop in the way that people thought they would. So it's 50 plus years since the first mobile phone call. There's been an astonishing technical evolution. And what nobody expected was that actually the phone is used in a completely different way from what this innovator had originally thought. It's not used for voice, it's used for communication and for access. And the worry at this point was all about radio frequency damaging the brain, and now the worry is all about the fact that the children are not paying attention in school because they're on their phone. So unplanned societal consequences are normal in technological innovation, and this is something that we need to bear in mind when we do ethical thinking. So at the moment, one of the big questions I know in Spain is whether mobile phones should be allowed in school or not. This is a really important question. It's an ethical question. It goes to the heart of the question of big societal topics like why do we send children to school? And you get these big political controversies. So here is a study recently published in Lancet, which is a British study, and it's a sort of a randomized controlled trial comparing schools which allow phones with schools that ban phones, and looking at the well-being of the children and looking at the exam results. No difference. No difference whether your kid goes to a school with phones or a school without phones. So, you know, lots of political controversy. That does not mean that we should allow all of our children to use the phone in school. Maybe this study has the wrong measurements. Maybe the exam result is not the important thing about the school. Maybe it's actually the socialization. But it's just an example that we all know about tech ethics being full of unintended consequences. So I want to think particularly about the metaverse. This is a quite text slide, but it's not new. It's just sort of taking a survey of where we are. So ethics is important. We want to live in a good society, and when we have technological innovations like the metaverse, we want to check that the metaverse is at least as nice as we are. So do we want the metaverse to be nicer than real life? Probably yes. Or do we really not care at all? And I think the default position should be that we have the same ethical standards in the metaverse as we have in real life. So when something new happens, we don't want to say, oh, it's new, so we can drop the ethical standards. Ethical standards should be consistent, they should be constant, and over the long term, they should not go down. So maybe they can even go up. So maybe one of the points about new technologies and about progress and civilization is that ethical standards we can be better. And here we need to think carefully about the relationship between technology and society, because the metaverse is a technology used by individuals for their individual interests and their individual pursuits. And society very carefully regulates what individuals can do. So society does not allow me to do everything I want. It doesn't allow you to do everything you want. And we have institutions like morality, which is an idea, and law, which is a system, a structure, which carefully regulate what each person can do. And in general, I think there are big risks for any part of society, including technology industries, including the technology sector, from bypassing or subverting societal consensus. So society has evolved over historical time to have these codes which regulate individual behavior. So all known human societies have something like morality and law. It differs between one society and another, but they all have something. And you don't want to mess with that. You don't want to change that. And you have to remember, of course, that society is diverse, and that some groups and some individuals are especially vulnerable. So these are things that you need to bear in mind when you have any innovation. I think you don't want to change that. And the problem is that, particularly with an individualized technology, there will always be some people who try to make ethical space. This is quite normal. If you have had children, you know that they spend perhaps 25 years trying to break the rules. Maybe some adults spend 75 years trying to break the rules. This is normal. That happens in societies, that you get tension between the individual and social. And you need to deal with that in your technology. And in general, one of the things that societies tend to do is they tend to have some sort of public shame process, things like courts and social punishment to stop people from making ethical space. Okay, so that's why we need ethics, and that's why it's a societal responsibility. That's why, for example, universities need to care about it. That's why a university program in technology ethics is a good, positive thing for society to have and for technical industries to support. And the question is, how do you do it? So this slide is going to be really useful for those of you who don't know or care about ethics, because it's kind of like a passport. So get your cameras ready in case you have to write grant application with a section on ethics. What people often want is some really simple ways of thinking, how can I do my tech project and not make a big ethical mistake? Are there some simple rules, some simple frameworks which help? And I want to propose two. So one actually comes from biomedicine. So medicine has had to organize its ethics carefully because it has a bad history of, sort of dangerous doctors. So there's been a lot of work in biomedical ethics, which is basically quite good. It's come up with some 4 simple rules that you need to remember when you do any medical intervention, if you're a doctor or if you're a medical researcher. So the first one is do not harm the patient. Second one is if you can help the patient, do. Third one is respect the fact that the patient is an autonomous individual who will and should make free choices and must have some control over their own life. And fourth one, which is perhaps the most controversial and most interesting one, is you must always consider not just the patient, but also wider society and the issue of justice. So you have to always bear in mind, is what I'm doing for you fair? So, what about the other people who are not in this medical relationship? How are they represented? How are we thinking about this at the societal scale? So these principles were developed in response to several medical scandals where the medical profession had performed incorrect research practices. And they've lasted now for about 50 years very successfully, and they still work well. So these are designed for medicine, but actually they work fine for tech. If I have a new product, let's say a metaverse product, it's really useful just to stress test the new product by checking whether these 4 principles you can tick the box. So this is a really good way in tech, I think, to stress test innovations and to identify individual responsibilities. So if you're designing a new tech, or if you are developing new software, or if you're proposing a research use case, then you can ask yourself, am I doing harm? Yes or no? Am I doing good? Yes or no? Am I respecting the user's autonomy? Yes or no? What about everybody else? These are great questions which we can all use in our individual research and innovation work. So that's really useful toolkit. The second is slightly more complex toolkit, but again, it's useful, particularly in research programs. And this is an EU project called the Responsible Research and Innovation Toolkit. It's a little bit old-fashioned now. It's about 10 years old, and Miguel, in Miguel's talk earlier this afternoon, he proposed another one which looked a little bit more complex, and I want to read it and see if it's any better. I'm not sure it is. But the Responsible Research and Innovation Toolkit is a way of thinking about the consequences of technological innovations. And it proposes a series of 4 steps where you anticipate the likely consequence of, for example, a new technology or a new metaverse use. You reflect on the process of introducing the new innovation. You check that everybody is included, and you change the program based on what you find. So the critical one of adaptation, sometimes they call it response, it basically means sometimes your research is wrong. Sometimes you've got the wrong idea. Sometimes you need to change your plan. This is a very useful structure for guiding large-scale research programs, and it's a very good way to think about how you interface technology research with wider society, if you have dialogue with stakeholders when you're developing a research program. Now, these words are a bit abstract and a bit vague, so I've translated them for you. So this is what you actually do here in italics. So one problem with the Responsible Research and Innovation Toolkit is there are a lot of sort of philosophy of science people and policy people have written lots of papers. This paper here, for example, is really, really good, but it's full of jargon. So what I've shown here in italics is what you actually do when you take away the jargon. And this is a very useful way of thinking about it. I've been the ethics lead in a European project on non-contact haptics, ultrasound haptics, and we ran a major work package based on the Responsible Research and Innovation, and it turned out to be very, very productive and led to several important technological and research developments within the research project. So this is an ethics approach which is embedded in research. It works really well if you want to put your ethics not just as a report that you write at the end to say that you're not a bad person, but if you want to build the ethics into your research, RRI is a great way to do it. So, you know, those of you who don't really care about ethics, I think, can use these toolkits in a way that will help. Okay, so using these toolkits, we can think about, I mean, the particular problem that I've thought about most was haptic technologies. And we can look at the developing haptic technologies. Many of these are metaverse related or metaverse compatible. And we can try to identify, well, where are the issues? Where are the ethical issues going to arise? So in the case of haptic technologies, it seemed to me that it makes a really big difference whether we're talking about touch on the hand for manual interaction or touch on the whole body. These are typically vests and clothing type applications. So a really important question for the ethics of touch is, which bit of me are you touching? It makes a big difference whether your tech is touching my fingers or touching my face or some other part of me. So location, really simple, sort of straightforward thing, which when you design your sensor and when you build your kit, you perhaps don't even think about location, because you cannot put a glove on your leg. You can only put the glove on your hand, but it's ethically important. There's a really important question for haptic technologies about how they're used. So function is a very abstract word, but sometimes the haptics are used, for example, to explore an object in haptic robotics. Sometimes they're just used to tell you, oh, call your mum through a smartwatch. So this is really important ethically because, for example, the user understanding of why they're being touched is completely different depending on whether they are actively exploring the environment or whether they're being told to do something. And there's a particular question that we came up about with wearable computing, which I'll come back to later, being a really interesting problem for ethics of immersive touch. Okay, there's only one idea in this whole talk. There's one new idea. It's on this slide. So it's the idea of sensory autonomy. So we thought that this was the single most important concept for understanding the ethics of digital touch, and actually it's the ethics of the whole metaverse as well. So the idea is that what it means to be an individual and a person, an adult, who is able to make their own choices and decide on their life. What it means is that you're controlling your sensory inputs. And all of what makes you you and important and unique and autonomous and worth respecting, and makes me unique and autonomous and worth respecting, is really reflected in our choices of what we hear, what we look at, where we go, and our ability to control our own inputs. So this is absolutely fundamental. I don't like your music, so I ask you to put on headphones, or I put on my own headphones, and then I have autonomous control over what I hear. I don't like watching violence in the movies, so I do this, and I have a right to do this. There are a lot of good movies with 1 or 2 violent scenes, and I say to my wife, okay, I'd love to go to the movie because I know it's a good director, but please tell me when there's a violent bit, and I will put my hands over my eyes, and I've got a right to do that. And you know, some people can cope, and other people can't, and they have the ability to control the inputs to which they're exposed. So this is really an absolutely fundamental aspect of our concept of a person, that we recognize that you should not have to listen to my music, and I should not have to accept inputs that I don't agree to accept. This is really important in the metaverse. And thinking about what we call human rights, actually this is human rights. So if you look at freedom of movement is a fundamental human right. And actually all it really means is you can go somewhere where you get sensory inputs which suit you more. So right now, there are a lot of people who are going from London to Alicante, and maybe they're doing it, well, maybe because of Brexit or something, but maybe they're doing it because they don't like the cold and they do like the sun. So that's sensory autonomy. That's choosing what kind of inputs they want. In this case, it's a thermal input. So in this case, things like migration and the way that we navigate and choose where we go in the world is really about exercising our right to sensory autonomy. And this is really, really important in all of the technologies that create sensory inputs and create virtual worlds and immersions, is we need to respect the individual's choice over the inputs that they get from us as designers and so on. And the problem is really about touch, because touch is always on. You cannot switch your skin off in the way that you can put on your headphones or shut your eyes. You can't control the inputs on your bodily senses, your somatosensory system, in the same way that you can control your visual inputs and your sound inputs. You can put your fingers in your ears if you don't like what you hear, but if you're getting touch on your body, you can't not feel it. So what this means is that an embodied or somatosensory immersive environment follows us around, and any tactile device potentially challenges our sensory autonomy. So I think the real sort of ethical status of the individual in the metaverse is not decided based on the visual part or on the auditory part. It will be decided based on the touch part. So that's the real immersion. Okay, so all autonomy and all is really sensory autonomy. That's the argument. So I think this is quite interesting, and it's an important part of the idea that we develop in the paper on which this talk is based. What are we going to do about it? Well, the key insight we had when we did an ethical analysis of sensory autonomy is that in the case of touch, sensory autonomy sometimes is a problem and sometimes it isn't. So the good news is that if you're building an application where the user interacts physically with their environment, then this is what's called active touch. You're using your sense of touch to explore your environment. And you don't really have a big ethical problem, because I choose to reach for the bottle. I've decided that I want to feel the cold water against my palm or against my cheek. I'm in active control of the sensory inputs that I want. Okay? So when people are making haptic exploration of an immersive environment, the action that they make with the controller or with their data glove or with their hands is based on an opt-in action decision about what they choose to experience. So in a metaverse, you can imagine that you produce a virtual shop where I can pick different objects off a shelf, and I choose which object I touch. So I am using my sensory autonomy. Maybe I'm even increasing my sensory autonomy through the metaverse. And that's not really an ethical problem. If I don't like the feel of one of the objects, then I don't touch it, and I touch one that I do like the feel of. So there's no real ethical challenge there. The big problem comes with passive touch. So a passive touch is the situation where I am not doing anything, and something or some person is touching me. So if you brush my hair or give me a hug, then I am passive, and you are imposing touch on my skin. And that's potentially a very big ethical problem, because my sensory autonomy could be ignored or it could be subverted. You could give me a hug, or you could brush my hair without my consent. I don't want to have my hair brushed. I don't want you to hug me. And if it's passive touch, then there is a risk of unwanted and inappropriate sensory input. And clearly, this is deeply related to our social environment. Who is touching me and why? There are some people who are allowed to give me a hug, and there are lots of other people who are not. And that's me. That's my autonomy, which expresses who I allow near my body. And this is related to a very fundamental idea in neuroscience called the idea of peripersonal space. So the space around the body is a zone of really important emotional significance and possible threat. So we don't allow some people to get near us, and there are other people, our loved ones, who we want to be near us. What this means is that the user has to have some way to maintain sensory autonomy in any immersive situation where touch is applied to their body. The obvious thing is they must have an off switch. This is not a power switch, so in the review of the paper, somebody the reviewer pointed out that it's not a good idea to switch off the power in an actuation system. There should be a kind of safe way of switching off the tactile stimulus. That's not necessarily the same as cutting the power. I think this also means that any system has to carefully agree what touches are acceptable. So consent needs to be a fundamental system for any kind of, a fundamental principle of any kind of immersive interaction, particularly an immersive interaction on the body, and particularly for wearables. So we've seen that the kind of tactile vests, where there are sensors all over the body, they're now consumer products in gaming environments. Clearly, you want to be touched in some ways while you're gaming, but there are lots of other ways that you don't. So I think this distinction between active and passive touch, which has a strong basis in neuroscience, the brain areas and the brain circuits that are involved in active touch are very different from the brain areas and brain circuits that are involved in passive touch, but it's also really significant ethically. And it's really important in haptic design to think about that. So you might ask, is this really a big deal? Is autonomy really under threat? I thought it was very interesting that we've already seen this slide from The Guardian about misogyny in the metaverse. So there are particular vulnerable populations, and there's a very strong gender dimension in this area. So what's interesting is I think autonomy is under threat because this question about the gender dimension and vulnerable users, it hasn't gone away. So this is an article from The Guardian in 2016, and The Guardian helpfully tells you this article is more than 4 years old. In fact, it's more than 10 years old, and already this was a problem. And in this article, which is just from last week, from the 10th of June, this week, this comes back with examples of unacceptable gender discrimination and gender violence in the metaverse, showing that autonomy really is under threat. So I think we shouldn't just dismiss this, or we shouldn't say, oh, this is just a few bad people. And I think there is a problem that sector recognition of autonomy is not progressing very much or very fast. And I think the chair that you have here is really excellent because it potentially is a focus where discussion of these issues could begin at the point of training. So I think universities and the academic sector has a space for leadership by including the training of the ethical dimension into the academic program. And just to show you that autonomy is possible, this is a really, really good book. And it's a book, sort of a medical manual for women. And it was developed by a group of women in Boston who felt that they wanted to take ownership of their own health because it was difficult for them to talk to male doctors. So they started a cooperative and they wrote not quite a textbook, but a self-help group or a manual about the autonomous control of their own bodies in the context of health and medicine. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's lasted for 50 years. It's now something like its 30th edition. And you can still read it. And it's an example of autonomy in action. So it's a different medium. It's a book. Maybe it should be, maybe somebody could do a good student project to translate it to the metaverse. But you can achieve these kinds of autonomies. This is the point. Okay, so then what we need is some simple ways to as designers, as researchers, as the people who create and propose the technological innovation, we need some simple ways that we can have device and interaction design that preserves or advances sensory autonomy. What can you do? What can you do to make things better rather than risk allowing other people making them worse? Well, to some extent, you can look at the hardware and you can consider what are the issues that different kinds of hardware involve. So here are just some rather old examples of immersive touch-related interfaces. And you can see that if you consider each of them from the point of view of sensory autonomy, they raise slightly different questions. So a haptic-enabled controller is something which is normally used in active touch. It's normally something which is used, for example, in exploring an environment. So possibly this kind of agentic haptically enabled way of interacting with the world might be ethically safe, because the user can always put it down, or the user can always stop navigating through that immersive environment, or they can always switch off the haptics. So this is relatively easy to control, and it's relatively easy to preserve your sensory autonomy while you're using it. These kinds of devices, perhaps not. Perhaps if I'm wearing a haptic vest and I'm in the metaverse and I'm in an immersive environment, I'm abandoning my sensory autonomy to the person who has programmed the interaction. And I'm basically allowing them to put lots of stimuli into some quite personal bits of my body, which assumes a level of intimacy, and I'm trusting them to be an ethical designer. So let's just hope they are. Let's hope that they've heard this presentation and read the paper. These kinds of things are quite interesting. These are sort of wrist devices, which are universal right now, and then often they're used for haptic alerting. So they really just, call your mum kind of alerts. And I think what's happening here is that when you put on the watch, you're giving consent to be interrupted later because you've forgotten to call your mum, right? So there's an odd functional transaction of consent that, I'm going to allow a system to interact directly with my body because I know that I'm going to forget to call my mum and I actually want to be reminded. So explicit transaction of consent is I think, very it's sort of clear already in alerting, but it will be interesting to see whether these kinds of wrist-based interfaces go beyond alerting and start becoming have different implications for autonomy. The reason why autonomy is important is that we can work together. So humans are social animals, and we all are more or less able to work together and share common space, even quite close common space. So you can get quite close to other people, you can even touch their bodies, and it can all be fine. And it helps if it's symmetric. So person-to-person interactions tend to be safer when you don't have a big power difference. When you have a power difference, that's an asymmetric interaction, and that always produces a risk. So this is why, for example, there are very careful regulations about what, a teacher can do with a student, right? Because there's obviously a power relation there. But when you have a more symmetric power relation between people who don't have any obvious explicit or implicit power hierarchy, then it's the ethical risks are lower, and the ethical risks are always lower when you know who you're dealing with. So deception, pretending to be somebody whom you're not, is always a massive risk, particularly for direct interactions involving the body. You really want to know who you're getting close to. And that's obviously a problem with the metaverse, which incidentally is the main problem that's picked up in this article. So the main worry in the gender dimension in the metaverse that's cited in this article is really about how do you know who's in the interaction with you. Okay, I think this is almost the last slide. I've dealt with sensory autonomy, which is my main new idea, but there are some other ideas floating around in the metaverse. There are some other sorts of concerns. So one concern is that we might get confused between what's real and what's not real. We need to have some way of knowing what's really true and not confusing the real world with the virtual world. This is a fairly common idea. I don't know how deeply threatening it is. In the case of touch, there's this sort of feeling that you don't actually believe until you can touch something. So this is Thomas, the disciple, who wouldn't believe that Jesus had come back from the dead until he touched Jesus and put his finger into Jesus's wounds and then said, "Oh, now I believe." So I'm showing this because it's an absolutely gorgeous painting, but it's also an example of the idea that the sense of touch may be an important part in keeping us in contact with physical reality. So this means that when haptic technology evolves to produce touch deepfakes, there's going to be a challenge. At the moment, the technology is not there, but who knows, it might arrive, and then it really will be a challenge. I don't know yet how deceptive or how dangerous it will be. I think the brain is plastic. This is something that came out strongly from Mavi's talk this afternoon, and it's possible that we will be able to adapt and we will be able to cope with new tactile realities. So I don't know how afraid we really need to be about the possibility that we will not know in the future whether an object is real or not when we touch it, because the touch might have been artificially generated. I think we don't yet know how serious this problem is, although traditionally it's considered to be important. Because touch happens on the body, it's a very useful technology to change the way we think about the self. So self-awareness and self-perception and self-interpretation and self-esteem and self-confidence, all of these kinds of things will be changed in the metaverse, and particularly in the immersive metaverse. So there's a big question about whether I'm going to choose an avatar that looks like this because I don't have any muscles, and maybe I feel bad about that, and maybe this is the avatar I want, and maybe the metaverse is going to be a good way to address body dysmorphia and to address so-called bigorexia. But maybe that's got many severe ethical risks. Maybe we won't be able to cope mentally with producing immersive experiences and avatars which are not based on what we are really physically like. So there may be a conflict between the self in the virtual environment and the self in the real world, which will not solve mental health problems, but produce mental health problems. We don't know. These own body transformations will become common. I think for the moment, we have to at least assume that neuroplasticity and the ability that human society and human brain has to adapt might make metaverses safe. So there's always been this worry that technology is going to make us stupid. It's historically, if you look back at the point when printing was developed, there was a worry that books will make us stupid because we will no longer need to remember. We will just use books instead of our memory. And now, I think, with the success of search, there's a worry that you don't need to learn anything because you can search for it every time you need it. So there are all these concerns. And actually, one view of the human mind is that technology is just a way that the human mind can expand and make new bits of itself. So a book is just a new bit of my memory, and a search function is a new way of looking through the library. So it may be that we're okay, and that the ability of the mind to extend into the world and to bring in new tools might make the metaverse safe. I wanted to put could make the metaverse safe, but I'd like to get everything on one line. So I've put can make the metaverse safe. I don't know if it can, but it might. So we don't yet need to panic about that, but we need to be careful. I think what we do need to remember is control will never go away. The problem that individuals are and should be autonomous, and this is key to their mental health, and societies have built-in power asymmetries which need very, very careful management to avoid damaging individuals and thus damaging societies. This only works if people know who they're dealing with, if I know who I am talking to, seeing, touching, and transparency of interaction and transparency of control is always going to be an ethical problem. And we always need to bear in mind in any immersive environment who is interacting. I'm interested in touching, but this applies to all interactions. Who is it? Who are they touching? How are they touching, and why are they touching? So that's a question that's never going to go away. I'd like to thank the Touchless AI project. The logo was on the first page, where I was it was a Horizon Europe project, a FET project, where I was the ethical lead, and particularly towards the end of the project, Orestes Georgiou became a really important collaborator in pushing me to make up my mind about what I thought about digital touch ethics, and we have a paper which is under review in IEEE Transactions in Haptics, not yet accepted. I think it might be soon, but the preprint is here. Thank you very much for your attention.
there any questions? Yes. Yeah. Did you? Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. It's very impressive presentation. Thank you. So I'm also developing some haptic devices now. So it's very just give me a lot of inspiration. So I'm very interested about you say like the active and the passive touch. So actually, I found it's actually the boundary between them is actually very, not very clear to distinguish.
Yeah.
And especially in reality, we can't actually reject the passive touch normally lots of time. And also, as Mel said before, there will be a same reality, whatever real reality or the virtual reality. So actually, you mentioned that there is that off switch, in the passive touch, right? I'm not sure, what's your idea about the passive activity? Is it always active, or what's your method to process this? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I think a lot of metaverse applications, a lot of are effectively interactions, and a lot of interactions have both an active and a passive touch component. So let's think about a handshake, which is completely first principles kind of tech social interaction. And in a handshake, of course, you have both active and passive touch. So they commonly co-occur. It's difficult to separate them. I guess if you're designing interactions, then maybe what I'm saying is just be aware that if there's an ethical problem with your interaction, it's likely to be not in what the user feels when they do something, but what the user feels when somebody does something to them. So focus your ethical worry onto the passive part of the interaction, or even maybe you don't think of there being a passive part. You're probably more interested in, or one might be more interested in programming the active part. So as an engineer, that might actually be the most interesting part, is how do I explore the metaverse, and how do I create an environment where people want to use the haptics to maybe explore some different textures of products in a virtual shop or something. So that's a great application, but the application and the technology also opens the possibility of a passive touch situation where, the robot or the product sample might stimulate me without me wanting it. And that's where the ethical problem will arise. So I agree that they're blurred and that they often mingle in many interactions, the active and the passive, but I'm just trying to draw people's attention to the fact that the ethical interest is probably on the passive part. Yeah, good point.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks very much for your talk. I like very much the idea of the sensory autonomy, but this made me think of we had some discussion yesterday about the harassment in the metaverse. Yeah. So, from the point of view of sensory autonomy, I can switch off if someone is playing music that one doesn't like and so on. But on the other hand, if there is verbal harassment, for example, I think it's a different right. Apart from the auditory autonomy, there is the right not to be harassed. This is one point I wanted to make. The other one, to see where do you put that and how to deal with that. And then regarding the, what is your view in the metaverse about anonymity? On the one hand, I think one should have the right to anonymity and to preserve your, privacy in a way. But on the other hand, I think in social networks, it's been obvious that this got the worst out of everyone. And sometimes it's unbearable, the level behavior. So if we would start from scratch the metaverse, what do you think it should be done about anonymity or identification?
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to think my way through these things from first principles. I think your example of harassment, and perhaps particularly sexual harassment, which is common, is a very good one, because one of the things that you can maybe do, and you probably want to do if you're being harassed, is to walk away and go to a safe space. And this is, in fact, something that many people do, and they're encouraged to do. And then you can say that you're exercising your freedom of movement to get away from the person who is harassing you. So so you're finding a place of refuge which expresses or which implements your sensory autonomy. That's perhaps an idea or one way of thinking about it. So I think freedom from harassment is clearly essential, and I think it's quite useful as a neuroscientist to think of harassment as being a very negative stimulus, and you want to withdraw from a negative stimulus, and that's a way of exerting your sensory autonomy. So your second part of your question was about anonymity versus identity. So, yeah, I mean, anonymity is the cause of many of the bad behaviors. And I think it's just really important to remember when we, where is it? To remember when we think about ethics that societies manage bad behavior through public means, like court. So a court in a legal courtroom is public. Anybody can go because society has an interest in knowing whether you are guilty or not guilty of this bad behavior. And we very carefully manage in society the understanding of the identity of whom we're dealing with. So it is wrong for me to pretend to be somebody else. So pretending to be somebody that you're not is very often part of a crime. So if I pretend to be Mel and I then sign a contract, or then that's fraud, and that's imposture. So society very carefully manages identity, because society can only survive if we know who does what, and then we punish them if we don't like it. So I think anonymity is an invitation for people to push against ethical guardrails. It's back at the beginning, I think, isn't it? So some users, some individuals are always going to push against ethical guardrails, and that's deep in the nature of the way that individuals interface with society. So society constrains individuals, and individuals have to balance the feeling that they would be better off without social constraint with the fact that they must live in a social world. And I think a lot of the problems that we have with tech at the moment and bad behavior in the virtual world and in the online world related to anonymity are the same kinds of problems which occurred historically in the period when societies were much, much smaller and strangers were uncommon. So now we live in large societies, and we have evolved ways of living in cities where we know perhaps 100 or 150 people, but we live with 1 million, okay? And we've made that work. But historically, that is completely new. Historically, we lived in small societies where we knew everybody. And in those societies, strangers were treated in a very different way from the way that we treat strangers now. Now we sit next to strangers on the metro, and it's fine. We have developed ways of dealing with it. But historically, in human history, strangers were a danger, and they were treated like a danger. And I think that underlines the fact that we do fundamentally need to know who people are, and we need to know whether we should be afraid of them now or not. So all of the people in this room are potentially threats to each other. So any of us could steal the handbag or the wallet or the laptop of any of the rest of us now and run away, and we don't. And why not? Well, because we know who we all are, and we know we will be able to find each other again, and punish each other, and that's what gives me security that you're not going to steal my laptop. But I think this point about re-identification, finding the person again in order to make a moral judgment about something they have done before, that's essential. And anonymity in the online world makes that very difficult. So I think anonymity is a problem, and I don't think we've yet got good ways of dealing with it. And I think it's particularly a problem when your body is in the game. So I think digital touch is an interesting frontier for the interface between sort of society, technology, and ethics. Sorry for the long answer, but really important question.
Yes. Probably now I have a long question. I apologize in advance.
No, that's good. Thank you.
First of all, I fully agree with this discussion concerning anonymity and identity. In fact, we have a person in Alicante, we have it here, that is working on a PhD about digital identity. And just to mention that sometimes digital identity is approached as a right of person of digital identity. And at least my thesis is that there is also an obligation of digital identity in the sense that can you act anonymous in the internet or with a pseudonymous? Correct, you can do it. But in the end, if you have to be accountable for your actions. Yeah. So someone must know who you are.
Yeah.
And nowadays, for instance, with blockchain and decentralized virtual worlds, that is not happening.
Yeah.
You can just access, for instance, Decentraland with an email. That's it. In my opinion, that's a terrible situation that we have to revert.
Can I reply to that part of the question? And then I'd be happy to take more. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that is a threat. I think a lot depends on what are the outcomes of your action in the virtual world. So if you are just searching the internet to find some information, maybe that is not going to change the world directly and have big impacts on other people. So maybe it can be open. Maybe we don't need to regulate who has access to information. So that is why library is a public library, right? And Google search maybe is a little bit similar. But if you are in a system where what you do has direct impacts on other people, for example, financial impact or sensory impact or something like that, then I think anonymity is much more risky. So we should analyze what is the application, and the more your action will impact other people, the less we should allow anonymity in that application. That's my judgment. Thank you. But the other part of the question.
Yeah. Well, the questions are the following, and these are questions because I found your presentation fantastic. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I received a phone call concerning the Congress. But concerning your proposal of these ethical guidelines, let's call them, I would like to know whether you have found problems concerning two aspects. The first, because I'm also approaching ethics but from a legal point of view, and I found problems to make the distinction between ethical principles, fundamental rights, and regulation as such. I don't know if that had happened to you as well. And the second concerns the global dimension, in the sense that ethical principles in one jurisdiction are not the same that in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I started my career in philosophy, and then I changed and became a neuroscientist. And I spent a long time hiding the fact that I had a background in philosophy because it doesn't sound good in neuroscience. Now I'm old enough that I can be quite open and relaxed about it. But I guess because of thinking about trying to do some conceptual analysis and thinking about sort of engineering problems and virtual world interaction problems conceptually in the way that you might think philosophically, you always look for the most basic analysis, the most fundamental ethical principles. You try, for example, to think about what is the universal principle for a person in an interaction. independent of whether they are in Spanish jurisdiction or any other jurisdiction anywhere in the world. So for me, the fact that different countries have different laws is important and it's interesting, but the first thing is to see if there's any general, universal part of this problem that we can get by conceptual analysis. And I think, for example, the principle of autonomy, that people should have as much, some control over the inputs they get from the environment, if possible, the principle of maximizing sensory autonomy. That seems to me relatively general and relatively universal. And when I said that it could even be a way of thinking about freedom of movement, I guess I was hinting that you could use it as something related to a fundamental human right. So if your conceptual analysis is right, then all of these levels may flow from a good conceptual analysis. That would be my hope. And also regulation. So regulation should provide guidelines and guardrails to industry based on an analysis of people and their rights and their interests. So regulation should not be independent of the conceptual analysis of what does it mean to interact with the environment via technology. It should be based on an analysis of the person and the experience. So I'm trying to do the most fundamental conceptual groundwork, and I would hope that it's useful for people in this and that jurisdiction, and also for people doing regulation. If the work is right, that's not my problem. If people do or don't use it.
Okay, so thank you. Before we thank Patrick, I just want to give an anecdote about the issue of confusing reality and virtual reality. So we had just had a paper published on that issue. We did an experiment. One part of the experiment is people walk into a bare room, they put on the head-mounted display, they're in another room, an experimenter says to them, a virtual experimenter says to them, sit down, and the room they went into had no chair, and 40% of people just sat without checking anything whatsoever, nothing. So this was really, really amazing that this happened. Sorry, 20%, that's still very big. 40% was another issue. So then I wanted to make a video for the paper. So at home, I put on the head-mounted display. I carefully arranged a real chair to be in the right place. And I was looking around, making a video, and then I happily sat down on the chair. And of course, things had become misaligned. And I had a really bad back hurt afterwards. So the issue of confusion between reality and virtual reality, I think, is really serious, because people sit on a chair or play a game, whatever, and they assume things that, because of presence, like me, we assume things that are really there, that look to be there, are there, and they're not there. This can actually be quite dangerous, as it was in my case. Yeah. So I think it is quite an important issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'd like to thank Patrick very much. And just before we do that, I'd say that I think you said you're going to go to the cocktails. Mm-hmm. So there'll be an opportunity. I know some more people wanted to ask questions. There'll be an opportunity for people to talk to you directly. So thanks very much for a fantastic talk. It's made me think a lot. Thank you. So thank you everyone for staying so long. This is the closing session. I don't think we're going to be half an hour. I think everyone looks very tired, and I certainly feel it. My first question is, where do we go from here? Would you like another conference next year? If so, where? London, Paris, Amsterdam?
We leave the question in the air.
Yeah.
For you to think about it.
Volunteers will to host it and pay for it as well. would be very useful. Donations would be accepted at the door. If you see someone with a hat collecting money, you know why. So, yeah, I want to thank Aurelio on that, because last year we ran this conference in Barcelona without any money. We did get money from Meta 3 months after the end of the conference, so you can imagine it was very stressful. And it was actually thanks to Mavi's group, who stepped in and provided some money and a lot of help, that made it possible. But this year, we were discussing in the EMRN how to do this, and Aurelio said, I'll do it, I have the money, I have the project. So maybe you'd like to say something about the project, yeah?
Yes, let's do some publicity about the project. Let's say, first of all, I think it was to have the second conference of EMRN was needed. It is usually the case, it is usually said that it is easy to organize a first Congress, but the second is a difficult one. So some help was needed in that regard, so we need to do it. And luckily enough, and this is not going to happen every year, I have to say it in advance, we are the Metaverse UA chair, the chair for the responsible development of the Metaverse. We are involved in a project that is run by a public entity in Spain that is called Red.es. That is the one that started administering the .es, but now he has several competencies, and they are administering money of next generation funds. So the project actually, and this is something I'm going to explain because it also reflects my idea of research in this area. The project is about what we call the Charter of Digital Rights in Spain. This is a soft law instrument. This is not compulsory. It's not the Spanish Constitution. But the government of Spain had the idea of adopting a chapter of digital rights to help courts and other authorities to interpret the Constitution, the fundamental rights in the digital environment. Now, we are involved in this project that concerns, we are involved in the project of what is called the implementation of the Charter of Digital Rights, and we are involved precisely because this is a next revolution, digital revolution, the XR technologies and the metaverse. And what we are trying to identify is how the implication that these technologies has for the rights that are established in that charter. But I consider that it's impossible to write about legal aspects of these technologies without having a good knowledge of technology, the social implication, and also the application that this has in several fields, like medicines or in other fields. And that's why I consider that it was quite relevant, although we have not talked that much about digital rights, that's for sure. And probably this is something that you should not tell Red.es. But still, I consider that it's needed to have this discussion about these aspects in order to do proper research about the legal aspect of the metaverse, and in particular the protection of these digital rights. So this is why I consider that we could use the funding of this project to finance this Congress. Mel had to fight for 3 months with Meta to obtain the funding. Last year, I don't know how Ines, that is somewhere around, and myself, I don't know how much we will have to fight to recover the money from Red.es for the Congress. But in any case, we will manage to do it. besides that, Mel has raised a question about when and where to organize the third conference. And I would also add another aspect to think about, and is to open the association to other members of different disciplines. For instance, after Patrick's presentation, we may think of philosophers in order to talk about aspects like ethics.
And haptics.
Yeah. But again, this is a question in the air for you to, and we would like to know your opinion about that.
Yes, so the European Metaverse Research Network started out as 7 members, just told to me by Meta when they approached me about leading it. And then we started from there. But in the last year or so, we've expanded, now that Meta's out of the way, we've expanded it to roughly double that number. So if you have some special interest or feel you want to contribute in any way, then drop us an email. Let us know your interest and how you think you may contribute to this. It's quite open, quite informal. We have meetings every so often online. We're trying to do some research together, which is to understand the nascent metaverses that actually exist. We're trying to do some ethnographic research in that area. And we had just had a paper accepted, which is a very, very long paper. One of the reviewers said it's like a book. You should have a contents page. It's about 70 pages on the various aspects of the metaverse, ranging from its definition through to various applications, ethical and legal, and societal issues associated with it. That will be in Frontiers in Virtual Reality, I guess, in the next few weeks. So I wonder if anyone has any comments that you'd like to make on any aspect of the conference or the network, and then after that, what time were the cocktails ready?
I guess within 15 minutes it will be ready.
Okay, yes. So anyone who has any comments or questions or any aspect at all of what's happened in the last 2 days, could you ask now? There's a microphone. Okay. Anyone has any comments? Okay. Yeah. Mavi.
Well, thinking about the future of the potential meetings or not, it just occurred to me that successful conferences like the Gordon Research Conferences, which are very relevant in the United States, and they are very well established, and they have a form of function where it's strictly, the speakers are strictly by invitation, and there can never be speakers that have presented like in the previous years, and then they invite new ones. So somehow they become a kind of conference that expands a bit in a controlled way every year, because they are very expensive and they need a way to ensure a community. So in the ones I have been, somehow they create, and I think it would be a good objective maybe for this one, they create quite a tight community that it grows in a controlled way, because somehow there is this policy of not repeating speakers, and they can only go by invitation, and somehow when people go, because it's very good and productive in many ways, then they join the community and it keeps expanding. So maybe since that is a model that works, it could be a model to follow. I think it makes a lot of sense to have a network on the metaverse, because it's going to happen, but it's not clearly there. So I think this forward thinking is important.
Thanks. Yes, Marco.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of report back to the entire conversation that happened at the end of the last session between Clarice and Aurelio. Clarice gave a great presentation about her work on sort of VR and technologies for people with disabilities. And Howard earlier commented that there's a new European digital disability, you can give it the name, that comes into force in 2 weeks. And Klaus's first slide is, immersive technologies are fundamentally inaccessible. So I think that's a big issue for these technologies, and I think that could be a really important topic that the EMRN could look at in future, because it's a big chunk of the metaverse for goods, because we don't want to exclude a large number of people, but it's a very complex, difficult problem.
Yeah, I just want to say that before we have the next comment, that sparked a thought in me. So imagine the following scenario: 2 people, X and Y, meet in the metaverse, and they fall in love in the metaverse. One lives in, say, Ontario, and the other one in London, England. And one of them keeps nagging, let's actually physically meet, and so on and so on. The other one keeps making excuses, and finally they do physically meet. And it turns out the one who is putting obstacles in the way is a locked-in patient and is communicating, or she's communicating entirely through, like Mavi showed before, a brain-computer interface, speaking and so on. So you may say, this is deception. Well, obviously it is, because the person should have said. On the other hand, it's also, there's other issues around that, because people with disabilities, if they're in the metaverse, should they have to wear a sign saying, I'm disabled? No, obviously not. This is discriminatory. Also, it kind of breaks some kind of data protection aspects. So these issues about what's allowed and what's not allowed in the metaverse, or in virtual reality in general, well, especially social virtual reality, they're really, really important. And I don't think the answers are obvious yet, but as Patrick also said, what's going to happen is unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. Okay, there was a question over there.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd just like to thank you for hosting the event. I think it was fantastic. I actually didn't know about the network. I actually saw Javier's presentation at CPDP in Brussels a few weeks ago. And I said, oh, and then he mentioned that this network was a thing, and there was an upcoming conference, and then wanted to come along. I would say we have done some work in the XR space, a lot about how you kind of audit, interrogate, scrutinize what's going on, which is a theme that kind of was touched on here, but not explicitly. Like, how do you actually know what's going on so you can hold people to account, so on and so forth. And just in this discussion now about how you want the community to grow, I think one approach could be that very controlled approach, like stage bringing people on. But I think there'd be a lot of people that would be interested in this context, but might not have considered a metaverse itself. For example, looking at other issues of digital rights more generally, other sorts of harms and issues that are occurring online, but haven't actually clicked that metaverse is actually a really interesting context for that, because it reflects so many more aspects of physicality, the real world, and things like that. So if you wanted to go the other way and try and scale up and build the kind of community around that, I think you could do that quite quickly, just thinking of other related forums. There's ACM, Fairness, Accountability and Transparency. It's a big forum that's growing like exponentially, basically about responsible technologies. I think a lot of the issues talked about there could easily be applied, not only brought to the metaverse context, but expanded in a very interesting way, because the metaverse would bring a whole range of new sorts of concerns and add extra dimensions to those discussions that are already happening. So just to flag, there's probably, the more stage-controlled approach of building, but there's also the other one of you could probably scale quite big, and it's a question as to what might be more appropriate or not. But yeah, thanks.
Are there other comments or questions? Yeah, Goran.
I'll take my chances. First of all, thank you to the hosts for a very nice conference. My comment will start with a bit of a cynical tone, but actually, I don't think we will end there. We can take it back. I'll try to say this carefully. Okay, so first time that Mel told us about this second conference of the Metaverse for Good, I said that this is kind of twice anachronistic, because the word metaverse is becoming somewhat contaminated or unpopular, But even worse, for good has become, I don't know, it seems to me at least, that around the world also this idea of for good is becoming anachronistic when we follow current events. But then on a second reflection, I think these things might not be unrelated. So, there might be some correlations between disruptive technologies and all kinds of other disruptions going on in society. So, in a sense, maybe this kind of thing has become more urgent. I don't know if I'm being clear or not.
Yeah, the correlation is called President Trump, I think.
I'm not sure. Well, no, so this is, again, these things are very difficult to study scientifically and to prove, causal relationship between social media and radicalization and whatever, and the election of all kinds of people who, we don't have to name names, but okay, Trump is an example. So maybe on the one hand, so this kind of might seem like an esoteric thing because we're talking about some of the things we're talking about are 40 years in the future. This BCI controlling the metaverse. So maybe there will be a way to take the spectrum from futuristic things that are of interest to many of us, but also looking at near-term impact. Maybe smart glasses, for example. I don't know, maybe they will come sooner than BCI-controlled metaverse. I don't know. Nobody knows exactly. But that might be a way, so, you don't want to be in the mainstream, God forbid, but maybe there's a way to relate this discussion going on here with bigger questions that are going on in the world.
I agree completely.
So,
but how would you do that?
No, this is my question to you. No. So I'm thinking things like, again, it's not about being trendy or stuff like that. I mean, okay, Mel and I have been working together, and for me, it's always been very interesting that, I'm open to new ideas. I'm a person that's open to new ideas, and very often I work with Mel, and I hear this thing that I think is completely crazy, and even for me, it sounds completely crazy. But then, after a few years, you realize that this is going to be mainstream, sometime or sooner or later. So, for some of us, this is okay, But again, I think maybe things like AI and smart glasses are around the corner. I have no idea. I'm not doing market analysis. Yeah, maybe there is like a continuous path from today's. Maybe the AI is happening now. So I'm not saying this should be yet another AI community, but AI interfaces, social AI interfaces, whatever.
Yeah. Well, the subtitle.
That's my 2 cents.
The subtitle here was like the relationship with AI. Not all of the papers reflect that, but that was like a theme that we wanted to put. Now, my remark about Trump is just based on, okay, it's very N=1 experience, but, we had a very good relation with Meta, I had meetings every week or every 2 weeks, and so on. And then in November, suddenly everything stopped. Why? Their priority changed, and we've seen that change, and I think it's not only that company, but many. So I'm against going with things that just are like suddenly the word DEI isn't allowed anymore. You can't say that anymore because it's out of fashion. It's not only out of fashion, but it's become almost criminal in America. They're firing people who work in companies who do DEI. So virtual reality for DEI is not allowed anymore. Does it mean we go along with that fashion? I don't think so. So keeping up with the fashion definitely is not my way to go. I do like to think of crazy and unusual things and go along with those. How that will be reflected in a conference, I don't know. Send us all your crazy ideas. No. It's still got to be a balance between the research interests with some balance of what's feasible, some balance of empirical data. And that's really important because there's a lot of speculation about ethical issues in virtual reality, in the metaverse, in virtual reality and so on. But there's very little actual empirical data. So empirical data around this idea is very, very important. In that context, I just wanted to, before I forget, is that we're going to have a special issue, a research topic in Frontiers based on this conference, and anyone who's submitted is certainly welcome to resubmit a longer version of your paper to that. It should be issued the call should be issued in the next month or so, and the ethics of it is definitely one of the themes of that research topic. Maybe ethics and the metaverse might be out, instead of AI and the metaverse might be our theme next year. I don't know. If anyone's got ideas of themes, subtitles, metaverse for the good, subtitle, what would that be? Metaverse. Yeah, metaverse for the bad. That's actually quite interesting. Yeah.
It's just the end of the...
Yeah. No, it's actually quite interesting. I wouldn't call it exactly that, but yeah. Okay.
I mean, regarding this problem that we may have had this discussion last year about the term metaverse that Doron considers it's very badly loaded. But I think, on the contrary, this network, for example, can rescue also, along with other people, this term of metaverse, that it doesn't need to be taken away by Meta. So I think metaverse is a term that we should use without being ashamed of it, because it's badly considered. It's because people associate it to Meta, but this should be disconnected, in my view.
I agree, yeah. Any other comments? Somebody? Yeah, Yannick.
What I think interesting in this conference is that it's interdisciplinary. There is a topic, and everybody sees the topic the way he wants, but there is a topic, and it is common. So that's the good news. Second idea is that then maybe as the web science, at some point they created something called the web science, I think in 2004 or 2005. Maybe at some point creating the metaverse science would be a good idea. But on the contrary, having metaverse for the good is also a good idea, because it sets a path and a direction. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Was there one? Tom?
Yes, of course I want to thank the organizers. Very good conference. It was the first one, and the first one I didn't attend. But I thought it was really interesting also for me. The audience, the presenters were from quite different backgrounds, neuroscience, legal, philosophers, technologists, and that gave clear different perspectives. Because I'm working as a technologist most of the time and so on, and really getting those other views in, it is very important when you're working in projects, when you're thinking out of the box, also to take that into account. And I think that's the strength of the network. It's all about research, and what is presented is really not concepts, it's research that's done, that has results. I think that's an important one. And then I hear also, the theme, that's also important, that you really are working towards a theme that is clear and that for the audience is, yes, this is what we're going to discuss, and this is maybe indeed also to get some results out of it. And maybe that's a bit missing from this conference. Okay, what results can we get back? Did we have a discussion on ethics, for instance, where we could say, yes, this is where we can work together on in a later phase? But maybe we can continue that in one of the online meetings as a review of the conference and as setting the pace indeed, what we're going to do indeed, what was discussed today. I found it a really good conference, and I would say Alicante was really terrific. The food is good here, the weather is good here, so London is not an option for me.
Thanks very much. Yeah, good points. Yes, Patrick.
Thank you very much. I've only been here briefly, but I've found it extremely interesting, and I've really appreciated the quality and interest of everything I've heard. I don't know much about the network here, so I don't know exactly what you need, but I think it's very good to have an open discussion about where is everything going. So people have been talking about growing, controlled growth or uncontrolled growth. That is an interesting question. If you are trying to develop a field, one very useful action can be to have a satellite day at before or after one of the major academic conferences in the field. So probably for this network, if you had a satellite day before a legal conference or before, I don't know, an AI or a VR conference, people then come because they're there anyway, and you get a lot of attendance. So that gives you good outreach and good publicity if the network feels that it is ready to do that. It produces high visibility. So that's one possible action that could be considered. And the other thing I have felt listening to talks is this is a really important issue. It's not going away. The pace of technological change is very rapid. There is not enough thought around the technological change. It's an extremely important area. So this kind of thinking must be encouraged. It must be important. And somebody said, what are the results? That's a good point. And I think one of the immediate results of thinking should always be training. So when you think about things and you identify problems and you achieve expert judgments, then it's important to share these with with other people, and particularly the new people who are coming into the field. So I think something on, and there is a big community of people looking for training in this area. So I think some sort of training session or training product or training flyer would be very, very, very useful. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I think we need to wrap up. I'll just say one point again about what Doron said, is that we started work in virtual reality in the early 1990s, and this was on a wave of interest in virtual reality. So we had one of the first head-mounted displays in Europe by a company in Europe and so on, and we carried on our research. And meanwhile, unknown to us, virtual reality was dead. I remember going to America in that time, and they say, what do you do? I'm a professor in London. What do you teach? Virtual reality. What's that? They actually laughed at me. And then 2012, 13, it suddenly all came back again. And again, I traveled to America. Would you do virtual reality? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? It was a completely different situation. So I think, yes, Doron's right that the metaverse, because of, as Mavi said, the whims of Meta and other companies, maybe it's a bit dead, but it's absolutely sure that this is going to be the future. Yeah. So I hope you join us next year, wherever it is, and contribute in other ways. I really hope.
Yes, to conclude,
yeah.
Because in order to be fair, before concluding, I think it is necessary to thank my team. Probably it is usually said that you have not seen them because they are in the back scene, but that's not the case. You have seen them around. But I think they deserve a big applause. I'm referring to Anna and Noelia in the back, taking care of the streaming. I'm referring to Jan and Malgorzata there. Thank you, girls. And I'm referring as well to Garrett in the back. I'm referring to Javier there, Giovanni, and Raul. You know, guys, that working with you is like an Who am I missing? And Inés, sorry. Oh my God, the most important one. Is the most important one because she's taking care of all the documentation, right? From now on. I apologize. You know, guys, that working with you is like training Football Club Barcelona. I'm not feeling, and this year I can say, remember last year I said, I feel like Pep Guardiola training the Barcelona of tic-tac. This year I can say, I feel like Hansi Flick training Barcelona. And here, who I have here? Johan Cruyff. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, everyone. Let's go for dinner.
Thank you to you. The proceedings are more or less done, and we'll put them on the website, and it will have a DOI number so you can reference it. Mavi?
Maybe the main speakers should include something in the proceedings?
Yes. I was going to ask if the keynote speakers, well, they're not all here, but the keynote speakers will send a paragraph so you can have something in the proceedings. I've already got the titles, but I haven't got any. So if you want to send a paragraph, that would be good. Yeah. So thanks. Let's go and have the cocktails.